Welcome to the Counter Narrative Podcast, a show designed to change the way we talk and think about education. By sharing stories of successes and triumphs, we aim to challenge the dominant narrative that often negatively portrays our disenfranchised populations. I'm your host, Charles Williams, an urban educator for more than 15 years, a current school principal in Chicago, an educational consultant, an equity advocate, and the co-host of Inside the Principal's Office. Let's get started. Hello and welcome back to the Counter Narrative Podcast. So happy that you are here with me today. Whether it's the morning, the afternoon, the evening, whether you're watching it or listening, thank you. Thank you for being here. So today I have an amazing guest with me. A friend of mine, somebody from the podcast world. So, I am not above. And so, Ryan, as we get rolling, feel free. We're going to talk about your show, but, make sure that you go and check out Ryan's work. We support one another. That is what we do in the world of education. So excited that I get to connect with him in this space. We've shared space on Twitter and in other spaces. So just happy that we're able to connect, get to know each other a little bit more. Ryan, how are you doing this evening?
Doing great, Charles. Thanks for having me. Like I said right before we started rolling, it's a busy time of year and life. We are in my district, we are ending the first semester, so we got a lot of grades due. And personally, I'm expecting my third child in 2 weeks. So living a very busy dream at the moment, but it's all good, and I'm really glad to be here to talk with you today.
Well, there you go. And so I'm looking forward. So you said your third child, right? In 2 weeks?
Yes. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Are you having a boy or a girl?
It's a boy. So I have a 5.5-year-old boy, a 3-year-old girl, and now we got a little boy on the way, due on Valentine's Day. So
nice.
So we're busy. We got, first kid just hit kindergarten this year. And so that's been interesting. And it's a lot of juggling. I'm this close. This will be the first time I say this publicly, but I'm this close to renaming my podcast, Sisyphus Juggles. I was a graduation speaker at my old high school last year, or the school I used to work at. And I gave a speech around the myth of Sisyphus. And the more I think about it, the more I'm like, yeah, that's where all this is going. Like we all have rocks to push and burdens to bear. And maybe that's really the angle I need to start taking on all this.
I like that. It's interesting. You mentioned, right? Like your oldest is in kindergarten. My baby, my youngest, is about to graduate from high school. So
wow. Yeah.
Like all those things are like behind. And it's like, there is a part, right? And my wife, if she hears this, she's going to be like, you said, there's a part of me that's like, I missed that, right? But then there's another part of me that's like, freedom. No.
Yeah, that's I'm excited. I'm excited for the third one, but I kind of thought we were done after 2. So there's there's some readjustments in the plans. We were saving money trying to maybe someday saving up to get a pool, and then I was like, oh, pregnant. All right, I guess we'll just get a bigger car. That's what we'll do. That's the trade. That's the trade off. But it's all right. It's gonna be good.
Nice. Yeah, my wife and I, we have 5.
Oh wow! So, congratulations.
Yeah, nice. So I understand. So, Ryan, tell us a little bit about who you are. What you do in education, your journey, and my favorite part. Now, we've learned a little bit about you, but something interesting. We know that you have 3 little ones, but something else interesting about yourself. For the listeners, a little bit about you.
That's always a tricky one, right? Because on one hand, I want to be like arrogant and be like it's all interesting, and in reality, it's probably all pretty normal. No, I'm Ryan Tibbens. I'm a high school English teacher in Loudoun County, Virginia, Northern Virginia. I'm originally from Pennsylvania, and I went to James Madison University and loved it. And I did pretty well there, and I got a lot of job offers around Virginia, and it was basically like, where do I want to end up? And so I settled into a pretty good place, and I'm pretty happy with how that's all gone. And this is my 16th year, and it's my first year in a brand new program in our county. So it's a 100% distance learning virtual school. So this is something they'd been talking about for 4 or 5 years. And then with the pandemic and everyone being sort of forced online last year, I think it became a moment of sort of the well, I'll adjust the language, crap or get off the pot kind of thing. And it went from planning phase to we just need to do this. And for me, if you had talked to me 2 or 3 years ago, I would have and said, hey, you're going to want to work in a virtual school. I would have laughed you out of the room. You'd be like, you're going to use all these apps, and I'd be like, get out of here. But I kind of liked working online during the pandemic when we had to, and I really liked cutting down my commute. I had a long 45 to 50-minute drive, and so it was sort of a combination of I'd been at my previous school for about 10 years, and I mean, I like it. I just, I'm not super interested in getting into administration, and there aren't really any other, big career moves available. So I was like, I need to make some kind of change. And so when I heard they were going to launch the virtual program, I said, let's give it a shot, and so far so good. So I've really enjoyed that, but we're halfway through. Tomorrow's the end of the first semester, and I've learned a lot. I've worked a lot teaching online, as many people probably learned last year. Distance learning takes a lot more prep and planning time. So I have been putting in a lot of ugly late nights and hours, but as long as the program stays afloat and goes long term, it'll be time well spent, because next year I'll be sort of set up. But yeah, man, that's a lot of it. That's sort of the big career shift recently, is the move to online and trying to learn to adapt to that. And very different sort of student body and all that kind of stuff. So it's sort of a good point. I'm about halfway to retirement, and I thought now's a chance to do something new, challenge myself a little bit, and the side benefit is I get to spend a little more time with family, which is good too.
Yeah, yeah, it's always a nice. It's when the pandemic hit, right, and we all started working from home. I know there was a lot of complaints about various aspects, but it was one of the upsides. I completely understand the commute. It's I spend 2-3 hours every day on my car. So
Ooh, yeah,
when
that's
I no
killer.
longer had to do that, it was like, oh, this is nice, right?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah. I mean, I had coworkers who literally lived across the street from the school that I used to work at. Yeah. They would just walk across the street and they're right there. And, I'm driving 45 minutes if there's no traffic.
mhm,
Which was on one hand was cool, man. I tore through a lot of audiobooks.
yeah,
I got a lot of books done. Now people are like, what are you reading lately? And I'm like, I've been listening to the same book for the last 2 months. I don't really go anywhere. So I'm not
yeah. I'm
getting that
trying.
done.
I'm trying.
But no, yeah, I mean, professionally, I think it was a good time to take on a challenge to do something new. And there's obvious personal benefits. Kids starting kindergarten. So I'm home, when he gets off the bus and things like that. So, it made sense in a lot of ways. But certainly came with some costs. Like I said, it is difficult, but it's been rewarding so far.
So Ryan, I have to ask. Obviously, with the shift, right? You spent what 15 years originally. You're in year 16, so all of a sudden you're virtual, right? And we were virtual, but now you're choosing to be virtual.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, and so, and maybe this will be our thread as we're talking. I'm curious. There's a lot of. It seems like nobody's kind of in the middle, right? Either people are definitely for having remote options, right, and they tout all of the wonderful things, and then there are people who are like, no, absolutely not, right? And there seems to be this kind of battle. And so I'm curious, what has been your experience, and are there any stories out there? Is there I mean, clearly you decided to say, I'm going to stick in this format. So I'm curious what your experience has been and what you've learned from it, that you can maybe share with us.
Yeah, it's um that's actually been something recently. Maybe I don't know, maybe starting around December ish. As the COVID numbers sort of ticked up
Hmm.
again, and yet a lot of places talking about going online. A few places did, but a lot of places, were trying to stay in person, and they'd shut down individual classrooms as necessary and things like that. But as that started happening, there started to be a lot of activity on social media, and some mainstream media sort of talking about distance learning. And I think the loudest voices tended to make, this is bad. This is bad for kids.
Right.
Don't do this. And I try to pick and choose those battles. It's not always worth getting into that argument. I've got better things to do than have that argument 10 times a day on Twitter. But maybe once a week I will do it. And I think the thing to point out is that it's not for everyone,
Hmm.
but the kids that it is good for, it's really good for. you know, and not saying that all school systems can necessarily support their own program. You know, most states offer something, but a lot of times the statewide programs tend to be a lot of asynchronous work with only
Hmm.
occasional sort of face to face meetings with teachers. Our model, I actually wish we would blend a little more, but we are straight up like a regular school day. Like we have a set schedule. I am here, like you know, for anyone who's looking at the video, you can see I've got the green screen behind me because I couldn't figure out how to get a background up in this software. But like this is it. Like this is where I work from. Um, and you know, for the kids who like it, they work well from home for a variety of reasons.
Hmm.
And I think that sometimes people shout it's bad for kids when really what they mean was it was bad for my kid,
Thank you.
you know. And or they say, well, you know, look how, you know, it didn't work in these places or whatever. And it's like, yeah, but you got to remember that the teachers were doing this with zero sort of prep.
Hmm.
You know, they were being trained on how to teach an online class by
Wow.
people who had by and large never taught an online class. You know, I remember sitting through a training from a guy who was telling me how to do this. I said, how long have you been teaching online? He goes, oh, well, I've never actually done it. I was like, well, what am I listening to you for?
He's
Like,
like, wait, how long has this session been running?
yeah, like what are we doing here? Um, you know, and so I really I think that style of the discussion, I think a lot of the things that people were upset about with, say, schools closing down in person or their own children being forced to work from home, um, created some negativity, and people are just sort of hanging on to that because that's the only experience they have with it. And I think it's worked very for the most part, I'd say it's worked very differently this year because now, you know, I'm working with students who chose it, with teachers who chose it. We had time to prepare and to sort of think through how are we going to set this up, and we're getting better as we go. You know, I think next year will obviously be a lot better than this year. Like in a lot of ways, this is like being a first year teacher again. You know, I have to prepare all this stuff. I have to rethink how I deliver it. There's a lot of stuff. There were some curricular changes in my county, so I'm teaching some new things and doing it online. So, you know, there are days where I go in and I do it and I'm like, class ends. And I was like, man, that was awesome. Yeah, it was great. And then there are days that ends and I was like, ooh, yeah, don't do that next year. Like, don't do that next week. Like, what happened? Um, but no, so, you know, that sort of discussion has been tricky. But I think it's something that more places should offer if it is fiscally responsible and reasonable to do so. Like if you're in a school division that can support an online program, I think it's fantastic. I have kids with their own health concerns, some COVID related, some kids just other health issues. I have some kids who have had issues with bullying or social anxiety and they're
Yeah.
thriving. Um, it also frees up the ability to travel. So, I mean, I won't name names, but I have a young lady who spends most of her time, you know, in the county where she's supposed to be. But then she travels a lot and she's like bouncing to Puerto Rico where
Oh,
she's playing
nice.
on a professional soccer team. She doesn't take the money so she can keep her amateur status to go to college. She already got her scholarship set up. She's now she's like, yeah, I'm going to miss some classes coming up because I'm about to play in the U20 World Cup qualifiers. She never would be able to do this if she had to attend school in person. But
Right.
because school can go with her, you know, like I said, she's usually at her house, but when she needs to travel, school goes with her. I had a student who, for apparently for years, the families wanted to visit, you know, extended family relatives in Pakistan, and she went and attended school every day. They were there for like 6 weeks
Hmm.
and she never missed a day of school, didn't fall behind. There were essentially zero effects on her formal education, while she also had the ability to gain all of this informal education. And so there's this really great degree of like flexibility that it affords people. And I think that since we now know we have the ability to provide it, I think we should. I don't think
Hmm.
we should force everyone into it, but I think it's a valid option for a lot of people, and there's a lot of different reasons to choose it. And so I hope that more places do, because I'm seeing the benefits for all those kids for a wide variety of reasons.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting because what I'm hearing from you is, I don't know, choice. I think we talk a lot about that, right, in
Yeah,
education. And I take the exact same stance as you. I don't think remote learning is for everybody, right? We were in that same boat. We're K-8, and so you know when you have like it's really hard for babies, right, kindergarten, first grade to gain foundational skills on the. I get that, right? But I also had middle schoolers who were like, "Hey, I can take care of this," and while I think it's great that like some of your students were like, "Hey, right, I get to travel and take care of these other things." I mean, we talk about the need for education to mirror the world that we're in, right? And to adapt and to like, I just think that that's the world that we're living in.
Yeah.
I look at my daughter who is now working from home. She already has said, she said, hey, we have a choice of whether or not we're ever going back. And so she's looking at those same things like, hey, maybe I'll get an Airbnb somewhere and sit on a beach and work.
Yeah.
Like we would never have been able to do that. So I just think it's great. And in my environment, a lot of times our students are also caregivers, right? And so it's like now I get to help out around home. Those are things I wasn't able to do when I was in school. Um, so I completely get it. I think that if it's for you and if it's working for you, then it should definitely be there. But I'm curious. So there may be individuals that are listening right now, teachers, parents, whomever it may be, and they're like, what are some ideas, right? This is something I want to do. I think that it should work for me or for my students. What are some of the tips that maybe that you have? So, you've been doing this for about 2 years now or so. What are some of the things that you've seen have worked? Like whether it's qualities for students or whether it's, I really want to do this, and here are some things that I should be doing in order to make remote learning successful, right? Because like we said, it's not for everybody. So what can I do to make it successful for me?
Yeah, and I think it's a good point that there are things that you need to do to be successful, and they're not always the exact same things that you would be doing to be successful in school.
Hmm.
And I think we saw that last year. For anybody who was online, say by force, not by choice. There was like a struggle for a little while at the beginning of the year, and then I mean it varied by class and by student, but I think most people sort of started to figure it out a couple months in. The problem was the narrative around it was already very negative. This isn't
Yeah.
working. My kid's struggling. My kid doesn't know what to do. Well, but think about how much time is spent in kindergarten just learning how to go to school.
Hmm.
Like half of your day is just learning how to like be a student, right? And then all of a sudden, like my students who are 16, 17, 18 years old, like all of a sudden it was like, no, you got to be a student a different way in a different place and have all this extra discipline. And a lot of them didn't know how to do it and took a while to adjust. Some people never adjusted. And so you always have to remember that anytime there's a big change like that, there's a learning curve that comes with it for the students, for the teachers, for the parents. You have to understand that yes, it's school, but it's not the same school. Like it doesn't work quite the same. And so I think having certain foundational skills are important. You pointed out that this can be difficult for younger students. I ended up helping out. My wife and I helped my niece several times last school year because she was just having trouble with managing the online stuff. And I mean, she's very bright and, she was third grade at the time. So she could do it okay, but that's a different beast, right? Because in my experience now, I'm looking at kids who are decent readers. You don't have to be a great reader, but you have to be functionally literate where you can read the assignment, read the rubric, read the directions on your own. Not that I'm not going over it with you, but I don't have the ability to just like walk over to your desk because I see you're not doing something and say, hey, like, let's get started. What do you need help with? Students have to be a little more proactive and sort of ask for help. They need to self-advocate a little more. And they need to have that sort of foundational sort of literacy to be able to start the assignments, to do the reading, and then the confidence to ask for help. And so, and again, not say it can't work for younger kids, but it's delivered differently. Like my program, it was originally planned for grades 6 through 12. And then as part of sort of pandemic response and using COVID relief funds, they extended it to K through 5. So
Okay.
we have a branch that's K through 5 that may or may not continue next year. That's a big sort of debate, budget wise and all this. 6 through 12 is good for next year. And then after that, I think it's going to depend on enrollment. So doing a lot of finger crossing, but, for younger students, it's probably a little different. You're probably going to need somebody around. You probably shouldn't be leaving a 6-year-old or 7-year-old at home all day by themselves just because the teacher's on the other end of the camera.
Right.
For older students, you probably don't need that. But big stuff. In terms of tips, you should have a dedicated workspace.
Hmm.
I have a lot of students who spend, parts of their day doing class from the couch or from bed. And there are times you can get away with it. That's fine. But that shouldn't be your default location. You should have a desk or a table, a place that's relatively quiet where you don't have a TV or video game sitting there to distract you. Think about how easily students are distracted by a cell phone in a physical classroom. And then imagine that you're at home and you have your phone and maybe a personal computer and a TV and an Xbox and your dog's barking and all, like there's all these other things that you really have to account for. So dedicated workspace, nice flat surface, be reasonably quiet. I always tell them like you need to still have school supplies. Like some are like I'm like grab some paper, write this down. And every day I have a kid go, "What? I don't have any paper. I'm on a computer." And I'm like, "Yeah, but how are you going to have the assignment up and have me up and write down notes about the things I'm telling you to do?" Like you need to have something where you can jot down some quick notes, so
Hmm.
don't throw away all the old school supplies. Just you're going to use them less, just, but you still need to have some of that stuff handy. And then again, like I said, it's big on time management and sort of self-advocating. Students really need to be in a place personally and in terms of their maturity where they do ask for help. You don't necessarily have to be a 100% self-starter. The teacher's still there to guide you and motivate you and get help you get started. But I'm not there to provide a physical reminder. I can't walk by and tap the desk or flick you on the shoulder and be like, "Hey, what are you doing? Get to work." That doesn't exist. And so there has to be a little bit more of that discipline where the student say wants to do it. But again, in most places, this would be offered as a choice.
Hmm.
And so if you choose it and you're choosing it for the right reasons, then I think those students tend to do very well with it. I do, for being honest, I do have a couple students who probably chose it for the wrong reasons, and they regularly fall 2 and 3 weeks behind on their work. And then I get a whole bunch of stuff all at once, and some kids do that in physical school too. So but yeah, it's a lot of the sort of soft skill stuff. Manage your time, speak up, stay organized. The things that we talk about, sort of instilling in students all the time.
Hmm. Hmm.
This is a format that really requires it, and so in a way, that's a good thing. Unless it's a kid who hasn't who hasn't started that journey yet.
So, again, I'm in absolute agreement with you. We've seen some students do some amazing things, in those spaces. Um, and I think all of those things are great ideas. I know in our building, we actually sent home kits, like materials and stuff with students.
That's
But yeah,
awesome.
you're right. It's there's a very difficult time, I think. And this isn't just for students. I mean, as an administrator with our teachers, when we have our meeting, like, yes, you're at home, but you're at work, right? And I would even have to explain that to parents, like, yeah, your kid is at home, but your kid's in school. Like, can you not ask them to, like, hey, can you put the dishes away? I'm done washing them. Like, can it
Yeah.
wait? Like, and I don't want to tell you how to run your own home,
Yeah.
but
Oh
um,
man. I had a kid last year. This is funny. I was teaching public speaking, and I had a kid in the middle of giving this big speech we'd been practicing for. And public speaking online again is a little different, but you
sure.
got to sit up straight. You got the camera on, eye contact with the screen. Do your thing. And he's doing it from his back porch, and all of a sudden you hear a door, and he goes, and he's like looking up away from the camera, and then you hear in the background, "You want a cheeseburger or something?" And he's like, "I'm giving a speech. I'm giving a speech." And whoever it was, whatever parent it was, could not have cared less. They're like, "No, I'm going to McDonald's. What do you want?" The kid is so embarrassed. He turns bright red. He's like, "I don't know. Yeah, give me a cheeseburger." And then he just stares at the screen like, "What do I do?" And I was like, "All right, man. I need you to tell him to get me a cheeseburger too. I'm gonna need you to run it by my house. It's a long drive, and you're gonna start your speech over. It's okay. It's not you couldn't control that. It's no big deal." Um, but yeah, it is something that I think you probably need to have everyone on board for.
Yeah.
Um, if you're a student that wants to do it and your parents aren't supportive of it, doesn't mean you don't try to convince them. But I don't know that I would. I don't know that I would jump at this chance if you don't have parents who are going to support you and understand that there will be an adjustment period. If you're a parent who's on board for it, but your kid isn't, I have some students. I have a handful of seniors who literally didn't know that they were going to be doing distance learning until a day or two before school started.
Mm.
Their parents had, they have health concerns. And a couple of them, I mean, I know a couple of the parents have like very serious health issues. And so they were concerned about their kid going into school and they can't bring COVID home and all this stuff. The problem is they didn't tell the kid. And these kids are 17, 18 years old. I mean, this is someone who should be mature enough not only to be part of the discussion, but maybe to help make this decision.
Right.
And the day before senior year starts, they're like, "Oh, by the way, you're doing school from home." That's rough,
Hmm.
and so the parent can be on board, and even a good student is going to struggle at least for a little bit until they wrap their head around what's been going on. And so I think it's really, really important that parents and students and the teachers, counselors, and principals all have sort of common expectations and understandings about what are we doing, how are we going to do it. Because like anything else, it's always easier to have a more clear conversation in person than on the phone, but on the phone is better than writing an email, and an
Right.
email is better than a text. And so if we're going to settle into this middle ground where we're doing the video chat and sometimes cameras on, sometimes off, you have to remember that you open up the possibility of miscommunication or, losing some information somewhere. And so everybody needs to work a little bit extra to make sure we do understand what we're supposed to be doing. We understand how to communicate with each other and what those expectations are. But where those relationships exist, I think it's working very well.
Nice. So, so I have a question, right? We kind of talked a little bit about that you chose to go into this. We in my district, we don't have any remote learning. In fact, it's a little bothersome for me. Like we said, right? Like your district was like, well, we're going to talk about this. We're considering it. Pandemic hit. Like it's time. Our district, literally the year before, we had an emergency day, and I said, hey, I don't want to lose any days. I don't want to have to extend our school year. I want to try this thing called remote learning. Are you guys okay with it? And we don't recognize that thing. And I said, but I think you guys should. Like,
Yeah.
it's coming. Little did I know. And then it was like
Yeah.
the next
Right.
year, they're
Yeah.
like, we're doing remote learning. But what's bothersome is we're back to that. So, just Monday, we got dumped on with a ton of snow. And I said, hey, today would be a great day, to implement a remote learning day. And they're like, yeah, no, we're not doing those. It's like, but like, but anyway.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
we find ourselves in that during emergencies like a quarantine.
Mhm.
So what I wanted to ask you is that for teachers who suddenly find themselves in a position where, like now I'm teaching online, do you have any go-to apps or programs or even a strategy to say, hey, you're not going to sit in this space for a long time, but this is kind of my go-to to bring kids in, get their attention, and kind of have a smooth either activity, lesson, or even a day?
Yeah. I mean, a lot of it would be situational, at what point in the year, and, going to distance learning towards the end of the school year, when this all first happened, was a little different because I already knew these kids. We'd been working all year together. Now it's March, and um, starting a school year, last year, starting, in 2020 in the fall, online. And I don't know any of these students, it was a little different trying to create that relationship. So, when it's a sort of a spot response, I think it depends a lot on what point are you in the year and all that kind of stuff. Um, in general, there are certain things that we would say, I don't know. I personally, I'm not opposed to direct instruction. Like it shouldn't be all the time, but it shouldn't be none of the time either. So
True.
when I've sat through professional development where they're like, if any of you are lecturing out there, you knock it off. I'm like, well, I mean, people have been learning an awful lot from lectures for like, I don't know, 1,000 years. So I don't know. We need to throw them all away, but maybe we do less of it or we're more targeted. I think in distance learning, you have to be ready for a little more of that
Hmm.
because you need to then cut the kids off and say, okay, now go work on this, go do the practice. Let me know where you need help, whatever. And so I think for teachers who have gotten really accustomed to doing everything by sort of pure inquiry, or they teach for 5 minutes and then the kids work and then they do five and then they work, that's really hard to stay on top of online, especially since sometimes it's hard to monitor. Do they need more time or not?
Right.
And so in my experience, when you need to just tell them what to do to deliver that content and then let them work with it, stretching that to 20 and 30 minutes instead of doing little chunks of 5 and 10 tends to work better, just because that way then the kids have enough time to work and then you can meet with them in breakout rooms, things like that. Any kind of apps that allow you to sort of track progress or even just make sure that people have started is really useful. Nearpod is sort of a new favorite of mine, and I'm not that good at it yet, but that's one that's sort of revolutionized a lot of stuff because we can say like, all right, we're going to watch a video, but I can embed some questions or some other content. The video stops. You have to answer this. Or you're going to do this activity before you can continue on with it. That is a really, really powerful tool when you're working virtually. Things like that. I mean, Newsella is pretty good. Just if you want to do some quick reading and it does some of the scoring for you. Things like that are adaptable are pretty nice. I don't know if you ever used No Red Ink for like grammar English class stuff.
Yeah, so I haven't, but my English teacher in our building, not like my English teacher, but yeah, she's the one who introduced me to it, and I was like,
Yeah.
oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, when we first got it, I was like, I don't know. I was just put off by the name because I'm a big red pen guy. People are like, it hurts their feelings. I was like, well, let me use a green pen for 6 months. That'll hurt their feelings. It's the color is not the issue. It's the tone of the note and are you being supportive of the kid?
Right.
But I started to use it a little bit over the last couple of years, and that's been a really good one just because you can't do a traditional worksheet. You have to
Hmm.
remember when you're working online, like the kid can Google anything. Lately I've been using lockdown browsers so the kids can't go and access other materials. I also have to remember that most of these kids have a smartphone or another laptop. So really what I'm doing is limiting their ability to use that computer.
Right.
Um, and in a way that, you got to even be mindful that creates a little bit of an equity issue because, the rich kid who's got two computers sitting next to him gets to cheat, and the poorer kid who doesn't have the extra computer doesn't now.
Hmm.
So I try to be very targeted with when do we use a lockdown browser. I almost always make a timer with it. And that way, even if you go to another computer, you don't have time to look it up. Like you need to just work through this and stuff like that, stuff that you wouldn't have to worry about in the classroom because I can see if you're cheating, whatever. So there's a lot of issues like that where it's little adjustments, but Nearpod's a big one. And then rethinking how you chunk the time, giving students that time to go work independently, and then you regroup at the end of class. But that might mean you need the whole beginning of class to do the direct instruction because a lot of times when you go back and forth too fast, students work at different paces. And so one kid's done and ready and the other kid has barely gotten started. If I give you a solid block of time, everybody has a chance to work through it. And if you're the kid that's done first, well, I've got a backup, I've got an extension activity, or you can get ahead on a reading assignment or something like that. So you always have to you almost have to double plan, here's what we're doing and here's what you're doing if you're done what we're doing. And so that's one of the complexities in the preparation piece. But it, if you can be flexible on how you time it and you don't mind doing a little bit of that sort of direct instruction piece that sets the students up to be able to work on their own, I feel like things go pretty well.
Yeah, one of the things I heard from you there, the kind of like Googling the answer. I have teachers tell me that a lot, and I in a way, I tell them like, well, look, if they can answer your questions via Google, then maybe you're asking the wrong questions, right? Like, yeah, some of that information needs to be foundational. You need to kind of have that with you. But unlike when we were growing up, it wasn't like we had Siri or Google, or right, like we had to memorize those things. Right now you're literally walking around with a computer in your pocket. So my challenge to even my staff is to say, okay, well, how can we force them, well, not force, I don't want to use the word force, but require them or ask them to say, okay, you have access to all this basic information. I really want to see what can you do with that basic information. Asking that question that Google can't really answer, yeah, you could probably Google somebody else's answer to that question, but
Yeah.
like like I want you
Hit
to
it
be
with
able to formulate
Turnitin.com.
something
Yeah.
original.
Yeah. The thing you got to be careful of with that, and you're right. Absolutely. You're right. But the thing that I always, especially as an English teacher, that worries me, I teach AP, so we're doing a lot of writing. The time it takes to check that work, like the amount of time that goes into providing feedback, it becomes an exponential increase.
Right.
So, I don't do a lot of multiple choice. I let kids vote at the end where I'm like, we're finishing this book and we've only got one day left in the quarter because we just had a bunch of snow days and things like that. And I was like, look, we were supposed to do this project, but I know we don't have time for it. But I can give you class period and we can write an essay, which is kind of what I want you to do. But it's a lot of grading time for me. I said, or we can do a test and you're going to have a couple short answers, which in the end, I'm going to see the same skills and all that. But the rest would be multiple choice. And they're like, and it's a split vote, but the majority went for the test, narrow majority. And I said, that's fine. So I make sure, try to ask questions that aren't easily Googleable. But the reality is, if everything turns into that higher order thinking, and you have a class of 25 kids, you're going to put so much time into providing the feedback and assessing the work that you're either not prepared for the next thing that you want to be doing in class, or you're putting in a ton of your personal time outside of contract hours. And so I think that there's a middle road there.
Sure.
Like I said, so we ended up with a test that had some multiple choice stuff, and I worked very hard to make sure that it was not things that were easily on, Spark Notes or Cliff's Notes or whatever. And some of it was, but and then the short answers where I really get to see can they think about it. In the end, I think that was a good compromise, and I do far less multiple choice than I did when I first started teaching. But I also, now that I'm online, I'm also seeing like, I don't think I could get rid of it now, because if everything turned into a writing assignment, I would just never stop working. And so there's a practical limitation. The other thing is, you say the computer's in your pocket. I tell my students all the time, I'm like, I know you can look some of this stuff up, but some of it you need to know. And they're like, why? And I said, because think of it this way. if you don't know stuff, you can't think stuff. And if you can't think stuff, you can't do stuff. And they're like, what? And I go, okay, ask me a good question right now about quantum computing. And they're like, what is quantum computing? And I said, that's not a good question. That's a beginner's question. And they go, well, I can't ask you anything else because I don't know anything about it. And I go, right.
Right.
You can't do higher level thinking if you don't have basic knowledge first. Now, yeah, I could give you 10 minutes to go Google it and look it up and do all this stuff and formulate it. But wouldn't it be cool if you already knew a little bit so you could at least start that conversation at a higher level and think about how much more ground we cover? Like, okay, so you don't have to memorize everything, but you should be trying. I mean, we're providing to some degree a sort of a liberal education. You should try to know a little bit about a whole lot of stuff
Hmm.
because that sort of opens the doorway to all those higher order thinking activities that we want to get to. We can do them better and get to them sooner if we get you that knowledge in the first place. So I was telling them like, yeah, you got Google, but your brain's quicker if you're using it right. So, be ready with that, and they like that, if you don't know stuff, you can't think stuff. And if you can't think stuff, you can't do stuff. So there's still some stuff you need to know. Um,
Absolutely.
but again, there's a middle road there. There's a compromise between the two extremes. It's not all memorization. It's not all, synthesis and the rest. Like we got to do a little bit of all of it.
Yeah, yeah. I used to put up random facts of the day, and they would ask me, "Why do you do this?" I said, "'Cause you never know when it's going to come in handy."
You got to know stuff.
Yeah, I said I'm full of useless information. It's usually great on trivia night at the bar, but
I'm with you. You know what? And this is something. This is a good conversation starter at any class, but it works pretty well online too. I go through the agenda at the beginning of class. Here's what we got to, here's what we did last class. Here's what we got to do today. Here's what's coming up next class. I always give them a 3-class span so they understand how things connect,
hmm
and sort of why we're doing what we're doing. And when I finish, I go, all right, who's got questions about the plan or what's expected of you today? And, I'll answer questions. I go, who's got questions about anything in the universe? And what's funny is you think about how some students try so hard to get the teacher off topic for a minute or get them on a
Oh,
tangent.
sure.
Every class, I give you the opportunity to talk about something weird for 3 to 5 minutes. And some days they go for it and we talk, I don't know, I say, try to stump me. And I usually know just enough that I can hold them for 3 minutes before I go, and I don't know anymore. You got to go look it up. And some days they don't ask, it's fun. Now that it's not a game, like they're not tricking me to get off topic. They don't try. They know they have a chance to just talk about it. So, like yesterday we talked about George Washington's false teeth and how they really weren't wood. It got weird. It's a dark conversation. We did that for a little bit, and I was like, all right, but it's stuff like that, sort of show them that it's good to know things, but also that you're a person and that you can have just sort of that random conversation with them. Somebody might look at that and say, oh, you just wasted 4 minutes at the beginning of your class. I'm like, nah, I, I showed them it's cool to know stuff. They all learned something of random trivia. It was a light moment. And I built a little ethos. They have a little more confidence in me because they heard that I knew something, those kind of moments that like, how do you create that flexibility? Just because thinking virtually, the natural organic conversation doesn't happen as easily. When I was in person, my classroom was never empty. Like kids ate lunch in my room, kids dropped by. I would regularly have to kick kids out, be like, get back to your class. I know you're skipping something right now. Like go. And I like having the kids around. That's great. You don't get that online. That people don't. I mean, once in a while, a kid will randomly pop up in the Google Meet, but that's usually like, all right, get out of here, quit rickrolling us or whatever. And so you got to create those moments for that discussion. So say the trivia moment and things like that are a nice way to just have a moment to talk like regular people, which is important.
No, I love it. I love it. And so, I just we've talked a lot about all of these different things, right? That remote learning isn't for everybody, right? You talked about the need for communication and building those relationships, which sounds a lot like what we do in school, right? It's just a different format, and giving students choice. I think that is huge. Just saying, here's another way, something that works for you, when the traditional approach doesn't. And so I'm glad, right? I'm glad that you're able to share your insights into that, because you're right. Like whenever I turn on, the news, or I jump into my Twitter feed, it's very polarizing. And there is a lot of negative conversations around, the term I hear all the time, and we didn't dive into it, and I don't know if that you even want to touch it, but is that learning loss, right? Kids online, it's learning loss. It's learning loss. I like to say it was an interruption to learning, but they didn't really lose anything. Um,
Yeah, that Um, I don't, yeah, I mean, I don't know. It depends on how you want to define it. I did an episode on my podcast, and it was a popular one. Just I think it was a sexy title. Like it was called "The Lies of Learning Loss,"
Yeah,
and then I had all kinds of people arguing good, bad, every which way. But yeah, I don't. I think that especially for the younger students, you have to be careful because kids who weren't reading at home, if their parents weren't reading with them, they took a hit. And I think a lot of kids, even if you were doing some math at home, if it's parents who don't know, and I say this as a teacher, if you can already read, I can make you a better reader. Like if you're a decent reader, I can help you to become a great thinker. Like I'm good at that end. My kid is 5 and we're still like, he's reading a little bit, but I would like him reading more. And I work with him and I'm like, man, I am not as good at teaching you how to read as I am at teaching you how to read better. And so then you think about parents in the situation where um, they're not a teacher and maybe they don't remember a lot of their school or they didn't like school or whatever.
sure.
Those kids were put at a little disadvantage because they didn't have that extra support. So I wouldn't deny that some students, particularly younger students, maybe lost a few months on reading and math. That being said, I think that that's not necessarily the case when you're thinking long term for distance learning. When students chose it, it's a prepared program. The teachers know what they're doing. I also object to the term learning loss because they were learning other things. It wasn't they didn't learn. They learned how to manage their time. They learned how to attend and behave in a virtual meeting. They learned how to navigate all this additional software and things like that. There was a ton of learning. It's just not the things they would have been learning in school before. So it's not learning loss. It was more of like a learning shift. You learned different stuff during that time period. Which may or may not be valuable, but I also people are like, oh, it's learning loss. What are we going to do? And like, look, let's take a whole bunch of 25-year-olds and give them all the state standardized tests they took in high school. Show me their scores, or take these kids' parents and show me their scores. And then when over half the parents fail over half the tests, tell me again about learning loss, right? Because if no one remembers the details anyway, what really matters? There's a lot of what we do in school that, in my opinion, it's sort of like going to the gym. You don't need to set a personal record every day. You don't need to remember every workout you've ever done. It's you're doing it. There's this process. It's good for your brain. It's good for your person. Like it's good for your character. And so as long as you're sort of getting that work, it doesn't really matter if, you learned a little bit less trigonometry. I mean, for some kids it does, they're going to use that, but most people it's probably not going to matter that much. So the question is, did you learn something and did you engage in behaviors that helped you to be a better person and be useful to the people around you?
Mm-hmm.
And I think for a lot of kids they did. So it's depending on how you define it, there might have been some learning loss, but I think for most people it was just a learning shift. You were learning different things during that time period.
I agree. Well, Ryan, as we get ready to wrap up, I've enjoyed our conversation. I really have. And I'm sure that there are people listening to this. Well, some of them may be yelling at us right now, but it's okay. We don't hear them. So if
They're
you're
like,
yelling,
you idiot.
message me. I don't know. Please don't. Actually, I don't know.
Message me, man. I love that stuff.
I was like, bring it on. So I'll be honest. I ran into my first set of like Twitter trolls the other day. Like,
Nice.
I was like, I guess it's bound to happen, right? You're sitting and you're throwing your ideas out into Twitter space. But it was the first time, and my wife was like, babe, relax, it's okay. And I was like, I'm not, this has never happened. So message Ryan, he's used to it.
Yeah,
I'm like,
I'll have some fun with it. That's fine. I like to argue, and when it stops being fun, I'm good at quitting too.
yeah, you're like, yeah, okay, I'm done.
That's good.
So, well, for those who are ready now to message you, Ryan, tell us how the listeners and those who are appreciating what you're saying, how can they find you? How can they follow you?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm a little bit all over the place because I also have an education podcast. So it's called the ClassCast Podcast, which is streams everywhere. And
no, I was going to say that was supposed to be at the beginning of the show, so I want to give you an opportunity to talk a little bit about it.
Oh no, it's fine. Yeah, I mean, I don't need to do too much. I just a few years ago, we have good discussions in class, and I had students who were like, and usually they weren't discussions about education. It was talks about current events or history or literature or whatever. And I have kids who are like, that was good. I would have listened to that outside of school. And I'm like, all right, well, good. Then you got a freebie in school. And then kids start saying you should start a podcast. And I was like, I barely knew what a podcast was. And after hearing it a few times, I was like, all right, I like to talk a lot. Let's do this. So I started the ClassCast podcast in 2019, and I talked to all kinds of different people, which is sort of the interesting thing. Like, it's teachers, entrepreneurs, former students, elected officials. Like, I kind of believe that everybody has a stake in education.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you find a reasonable person who wants to engage in that discussion and has an interesting idea, I don't particularly care about what the person's background is. If it's a good idea, let's talk about that idea. So I cut sort of a broad path through the general field of education. But through that, I've met a lot of cool people, you and, some others. We have sort of that little podcast group that shares ideas. It's pretty cool. But yeah, so I'm on, you can find the ClassCast podcast everywhere. And the website's classcastpodcast.com, but I'm on Twitter at ClassCastPod and on Facebook and Instagram at ClassCastPodcast. And yeah, that's it. And like I said, if it relates to education and I think it's interesting or provocative or funny, then it's generally fair game. So yeah, I'm a little less focused. There's a lot of good education podcasts that are very much like professional development or teacher experiences, and I'm like, oh, that had something to do with education. Let's play with that for a little bit, and
Sure.
and so we have some fun with that. Yeah.
Well, I appreciate you, Ryan. I appreciate you coming into the space and sharing, your experiences. Appreciate everything that you're doing out there in the world of education. So I just want to, as I always close out, just thank you for the work that you're doing. And listeners, if you haven't checked out Ryan, please, whatever platform you're using, go and check out his show. It is an amazing show. So make sure that you like, subscribe, do all the things, all the podcast things,
All the stuff, dude, all the stuff.
all the stuffs. So Ryan, again, thank you for being here. I appreciate you, and I look forward to all the work that we're doing in these spaces and reconnecting with you.
That's awesome. Yeah, and thanks for having me, and thanks for doing this as an administrator too. There's a lot of people who get in that position who, all of a sudden the lips tighten up a little bit and say like, well, I don't want to be speaking. So I love when I hear a guy in your position who engages with these ideas and has these conversations. So thank you for what you're doing, because I wish we had a few more people in administration who are going to be open to having these sort of talks. So it's great. I really appreciate you taking the time to do it in general and to talk with me tonight.
Oh, well, I appreciate it. All right, sir. You have a wonderful evening, and well, good luck on the birth of that little one.
Oh yeah, thanks.